Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Tarot to the Nines, where we are talking about the wonderful, wonderful number one. But is it the one and only? Hi everyone, and welcome back. Good to see you here again, and I just want to say a big thank you first of all, before we go any further, to all of you who have been participating so far in Tarot to the Nines. There have been so many wonderful comments. People are beginning to do VRs to the videos. I'm hearing from you about the explorations you're doing in finding your tarot birth cards and life cards and soul cards and shadow cards, and I've also seen that some of you are doing the homework that I asked you to do last time, which was to start looking at all of your cards in terms of numbers and the similarities between groups of numbers, and I can see already that some of you are having some very interesting insights as a result of that, so it's just great. So thank you all very much for your participation. We wouldn't be able to do this obviously without you. What I would like to do today is talk about one, and it's difficult really to think of how to go into this, because now that we're beginning to move into the numbers rather than the slightly abstract concepts of zero, which of course, as we said, is not a number, it's the absence of number, it begins to get a bit difficult to determine exactly how we should start the discussion. So what I would like to do is talk to you about the concept of the monad, which is a Greek concept, and it's also a philosophical concept. It was used by Pythagoras, and it's a word that indicates and means unity, everything. And of course the concept of one is very much about unity. It's about everything. Now, one of the things that I mentioned to you in my video about zero, when we were looking at the Fool, was this idea that when the concept of zero is birthed, i.e. the concept of nothingness, what goes alongside that is also the concept of somethingness. The two are mutually arising. Each one implies the other. You can't have a nothing without a something, because then the concept of nothing makes no sense. And equally, you can't have the concept of something without a nothing, because then the concept of something doesn't make sense. So when we start talking about the monad, which is the totality, the unity, the absolute one, we need to think a little bit, especially from a tarot point of view, about what we mean by that. Because obviously in the major arcana, the main card that indicates one is the Magician. And we will talk partly in this video about later on in this video, about the constellation of the Magician and all the other cards that go alongside that card. But it's important we don't lose sight of our old friend the Fool, so I would just like to say a couple of words there. And I mentioned to you last time that the Fool represents this kind of absolute nothingness. I talked about it being the all, I talked about it being the nothing, I talked about it being the abyss. So it holds different meanings depending on the context in which we're considering the concept of zero. But I also talked about it being the potential for manifestation, but nothing being there yet. And then within the zero, the potential beginning to manifest, and then the potential realizing its manifestation. So you could say that from 0 to 1, you have this direction of travel is an indication, a symbolic indication of manifestation, in the spiritual sense and in the literal sense. And here, this is the symbol that's usually used for the monad. And if you look at various texts on numerology and number symbology and so on, what you find is there's a little bit of quite interesting contradictions that you see in some of those books, because some of them will say that the symbol for one is this, it's the dot, and others will say that the symbol for one is this, which is this kind of monad, and others will say that this is the symbol for the absolute. But we talked about the absolute being represented partly by the zero, and also a lot of numerology books and number symbolism books omit zero completely from their discussion, which I think is quite interesting. So from my point of view, what I would like to talk about, and let me just put the light down a little bit so you can see the board more clearly, and I'm also going to push the door, which is creaking. We live in an old house. I've told you we have a ghost cat, but we also have creaky doors, so it's the perfect house for Halloween, which is my favourite time of the year, so that suits me just fine. So what was I talking about before I interrupted myself with doors and Halloween and lights? Oh yes, so we're talking about the idea of where number symbolism starts, and in some cases it starts with 1, and in other cases, more often it starts with 1, and occasionally it starts with 0. Well, I think of the monad, the totality, the unity of everything, non-duality, etc., as necessarily having to consist of both the concepts of somethingness and nothingness. So for me, this symbol, which indicates nothingness but also somethingness, mutually arising, is a symbol that represents the kind of totality of everything, and it is a reminder to us that the nothing and the something arise mutually. So it's worth just saying to you that one of the things that you sometimes see in tarot literature is this concept that the fool goes on a journey through the major arcana. It's sometimes called the fool's journey. Sometimes that's conceived of the fool literally going on a journey and meeting the other characters. So the fool meets the magician, meets the high priestess, meets the empress, etc., etc., etc. Other times it is kind of posited that the fool transforms, and on the course of this spiritual development and this journey that the fool goes on, the fool becomes the magician. And then the magician becomes the high priestess, and the high priestess becomes the empress, etc. Now, none of this is wrong. None of this is wrong. The analogy that you go with and the analogy you use is the one that is going to work best for you, so you've got to choose your own. One of the ways that I like to think about it is that actually the fool, representing this totality in potential, remains the fool, but from the fool emerges the magician. So a bit like from 0 emerges the potential for oneness and then oneness itself, so from the fool emerges the magician. Now you can conceive of this in any way you like. You can think, maybe the magician pops out of the fool's bag. It's just a symbolic representation, but I like to think of it that way. And we'll come on to talk a bit more about this when we look at the high priestess, because I actually would then argue that an interaction between somethingness and nothingness is what allows us to move into the duality of the high priestess, which of course, actually sits there between her two pillars of dark and light, and this very dualistic kind of motif. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So in terms of 1, what I'm trying to say to you here is that oneness itself is an interesting concept, because it's sometimes a question could be asked about whether 1 is actually a number, because if there's only 1, if there is only this totality, even the concept of number doesn't make sense, because number implies many. So some philosophers argue that 1 is the parent of number, but it's not a number itself, because a 1 is single, it's unitive, it's indivisible. There is nothing that is not 1. And we see this symbolised, rather interestingly, in the mathematics of 1. Now, I didn't intend this series to be a maths lesson, but since we did some maths on 0, and since I think that was quite instructive, let's do some maths on 1. So, in terms of the mathematical properties of 1, one of the things that we can look at is, what happens when you multiply with 1. We can look at what happens when you divide by 1, and we can look at what happens when you add 1. So if you multiply by 1, I think you all know this, it's very elementary. It doesn't matter whether I have a 3 times 1, the answer is going to be 3, isn't it? So in other words, it doesn't change that number. Same if I had 7,563 times 1, you're going to have 7,563, because 1 doesn't change that number. But the same is true if you divide with it. Again, if you divide that by 1, you're going to get that number. So 1, whether you multiply with it or divide with it, doesn't change anything. So in a sense, 1 is a great representation of the support that underlies all other numbers. You can't have other numbers without the concept of 1 first. In terms of adding, 1 also shows a very interesting property, because if you add it to an even number, you get an odd number, and if you add it to an odd number, you get an even number. So there, number symbologists would say that 1 is It contains both positive and negative. It is both male and female. It is, although it is able to, it's able to adjust duality, and it's able to turn things into their opposites, but it in itself is beyond all those characteristics. So that's just a little bit about the mathematical symbology of one. And what we can maybe say there as a result of that is that one, in a very real sense, is the universe's common denominator. It's that oneness is what underlies everything. And we might think that things are separate, we might think the world is divided, but actually oneness underlies everything. And just sticking with that theme, I'd like to just show you something else that I observe about one. Oops. So let's start with the magician again. And I mentioned in the last video that one of the things that's apparent from the magician is that on his table are the symbols for each of the suits. So on that table we have the cup, we have the pentacle, we have the rod, and we have the sword. So just as I said that the magician flows out of the fool, or if you want to say the fool becomes the magician, but in my mind the way I like to think of it is here's the fool and out pops the magician. Out from the magician pops cups, pentacles, wands and swords. So they cannot exist without this oneness, and this oneness can't exist without this nothingness. They are absolutely intertwined and interrelated, and it's one of the reasons that I often think of the tarot as being like a marvellous jewel, precious jewel with many facets, and it doesn't matter which facet you look at it from, you go into the precious jewel in its totality. Or a hologram, doesn't matter which area of the hologram you shine a light through, you will find yourself back at the totality of the tarot. So it doesn't matter what card you pull in a daily draw, it doesn't matter what cards you get in a reading, the whole of the tarot, the totality of the tarot is always underlying that reading and is always supporting you, which is why I think it is one of the most compassionate tools that we have, because it is totally supportive. It gives you everything, even though it sometimes shows particular faces of itself to you in a reading. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes here to see what I need to say next. The other thing to say actually about one is, in a philosophical sense and in a literal sense, if one represents unity, unity is a quality that everything seeks. Human beings seek it. We seek it in love and sex, that kind of desire to unite. And we even in our kind of metaphors for love, we talk about finding our other halves. We talk about being at one with others when we're in love with them. Our human race seeks it. We seek it through mysticism, we seek it through religion, and again that is about oneness and totality. We're seeking that unity with the all, with God, with creation, with spirit. And life seeks unity as well, again in a very literal sense. So we are born out of this mysterious morass of atoms and molecules and waves and particles that is the universe. And when we die, when this pattern of ourselves dies, all of that goes back to the universe. And if you want to look at it from a metaphysical, spiritual sense, you might say that your spirit is born into the body, and when you die, it goes back to from where it came, whether you're God or spirit, the God of your understanding, however you want to see it. But in a very literal sense, from a scientific point of view, and in a metaphorical sense, or a spiritual, theological sense, we are seeking unity all the time, and everything seeks unity. Everything is moving back towards unity. Okay, another way of looking at this is that the lesson in all that, and the lesson of the ones in the tarot, is that seeing oneness is the solution to everything. It's the solution to all the world's problems. Because when you start thinking about the problems that the world has, poverty, racism, inequality, wars, injustice, all of those stem from the idea that we are separate, that we're separate from the natural world, that we're separate from each other, that there is difference. We see others as other. There's a lot going on in the world at the moment, politically and in the news, about this, these differences between people and how people perceive them. And what's so sad about it, of course, is that, you know, if you listen to the message of the tarot, then what we are hearing is that everything is one. All is one, and thou art that. So, you know, what we see as separate to ourselves is actually not separate to us. And the ones in the tarot are a constant reminder of this, this thing. Now, I'd just like to give you a couple of quotes on this principle. So this is a quote from the 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙊𝙎𝙊𝙀𝙎 on the concept of oneness, and this idea that oneness is the solution to everything. Whence shall he have grief? How shall he be deluded who sees everywhere the oneness? That's the 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙎𝙊𝙎𝙊. And then we have a quote from Alexander Pope. All are but parts of one stupendous whole. And then many of you will be familiar with the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. I actually have this pinned up on my wall in the back of my door, but I pulled it off so I can read it to you today. And I want you to just, I'll highlight a couple of the phrases in this in relation to the magician card. So I'm going to ask you, as I do this, to notice the position of the magician's hand. With one hand, his right hand up in the air holding the wand aloft, and his left hand pointing down at the earth. So one hand pointing above, one hand pointing below. And here is the text of the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. True without falsehood, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, for the performance of the miracles of the one thing. And as all things are from one, by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. The sun, we'll come back to the sun is its father, the moon its mother, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. This is the father of all perfection, or consummation of the whole world. Its power is integrating, if it be turned into earth. Thou shalt separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, suavely and with great ingenuity. It ascends from earth to heaven and descends again to earth and receives the powers of the superiors and of the inferiors. So thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore, let all obscurity flee before thee. This is the strong force of all forces, overcoming every subtle and penetrating every solid thing. So the world was created. Hence were all wonderful adaptations, of which this is the manner. Therefore am I called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. What I have to tell is completed concerning the operation of the sun. So I'll put a link to information about the Emerald Tablet below. It's a hermetic text, and the provenance of this is probably too detailed to go into now, but I'll put some information below so you can read it. But one of the things that you'll notice in that is a couple of references to the sun, and just a reminder that the symbol for the monad was this, which is of course also the astrological symbol for the sun. And then another text which is relevant, and those of you who are familiar with Hinduism will perhaps recognize this, and also if you're familiar with a song by Kate Bush called Lily, you will be familiar with this poem because it's recited at the beginning of that, and I'll put a link to that song below as well. That's an interesting song because actually she combines this quote which I'm about to tell you about with a song which is based on the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. So that's an interesting one to listen to. And this is the Gayatri Mantra, which is available in various different translations, but this is the one that I like, and it's the one that's at the beginning of her song. O thou who givest sustenance to the universe, from whom all things proceed, to whom all things return, unveil to us the face of the true spiritual sun, that we may know the truth and do our whole duty as we journey to thy sacred feet. So inherent in that, I think, is the idea that from all things, or from nothingness and from unity proceed all things, all numbers, and all go back ultimately to unity and to nothingness. So, looking at the ones in tarot, let's just get our ones back up again. So here we have our aces, and I'm going to just put them all up so you can see them. It's worth noticing, we've looked at the magician, as above, so below, but it's also worth noticing at what we see on the aces. We see the gifts of manifestation. So here we have this hand coming out of the cloud offering, if you like, this elemental symbol of the sword, or of the cup, or of the wand, or of the pentacle. And the aces are a really good indication of this idea of beginnings and an offering, which allows the person who's doing the reading, or the person who's being read for, to see this as a gift. So the gift of oneness expressed within the elements. And the aces generally represent beginnings, they represent unity, they represent first principles, they represent the fundamental energy of the suit, whether it's fire, earth, air or water. And I think one of the things that's really indicative of the idea of the hand offering these things is it's unity moving into power and into differentiation. So you could argue, we don't know this of course, but we could argue that it's the same hand that's offering itself in different forms to the seeker. Okay, so the other thing to say about the magician, I've mentioned that as above, so below, and I've mentioned that the aces are inherent on the magician's table. But the other thing to say about the magician and about the number one, you actually see the number one on the magician card, and because it's written in a Roman numeral, the other way of looking at it is as the letter I and the sense of I. So in another way, the magician is a representation of the birth of consciousness, the birth of the ego. Whereas the fool, you could argue, is egoless. So the lack of an I, this nothingness, the fool is just allowing. The fool, we don't know whether the fool is about to step off the cliff and plunge to his or her death, and the little dog is yapping, desperately trying to warn the fool, or is the fool actually blissfully unconcerned by the idea of death or injury, etc., etc., and is the little dog egging the fool on, because the fool is just allowing, whatever will be, will be. By contrast, the magician is acting. The magician is pulling power down into himself or herself and into the world, and is looking at how to use the elements available to manifest and manufacture achievement, if you like, progress, creation. It's bringing the all, the unmanifest, down into manifestation. So that is some information about the magician, the aces, the ones in tarot. But of course, if you've been following this series, you will know that the constellation of the magician involves more than just the ones. Back in a second. Okay, so here we are back with the constellation of the magician. Now, I don't want to say too much about this because part of the fun of this series, I think, is encouraging you and inviting you to explore these cards and to see these cards and the connections between them yourself. And I know that some of you have already been doing that. You've started looking at the connections between different constellations of cards. But what I would like to do is just point out a couple of things. And I put some keywords down here for this constellation in general. And these keywords relate differently to the different cards that are in the constellation. The first thing to say is that obviously we have got the ones in this constellation, but we've also got the tens, because tens, using Pythagorean reduction, reduce to 1. 10 plus 1 equals 1. So that's the Pythagorean reduction calculation that we would do. And it's the same with 19, the sun. 1 plus 9 equals 10, 1 plus 0 equals 1. So these cards all reduce to 1, which is what puts them into the constellation of 1, the constellation of the magician. And some of the keywords that you can associate with this constellation, and they're drawn from all of these cards, are keywords like fortune and destiny. And what we might say there is, are we about fortune creation, going back to the idea of the ACES offering us this, this gift of elemental power and force that we can use to manifest, the way the magician is trying to manifest there, using the elemental powers? Or are we at the mercy of fortune, the wheel of fortune, which we know is going to turn? It doesn't matter what happens, it's going to turn, it's going to shift. All things must change, and things will change. No matter how good they are, they will shift. No matter how bad they are, they will shift. And so there's a contrast there between fortune and destiny. Is karma part of that? So how much of this is to do with what we are actively doing, and how much of it is to do with our lot in life, if you like? It's about initiation, so we're seeing the magician initiating, but it's also about responsibility. So looking at, the tens, what we start to see, we're on a different cycle now, we're at another level, and with the tens associated with the Wheel of Fortune, we see quite a lot of responsibility here. Sometimes there's the positive responsibility of, family and a home, raising children, responsibility of perhaps being an elder in society, as we see in the Ten of Pentacles, the responsibility of carrying a load, of lifting weights, metaphorically and physically, and then the responsibility of our thoughts. We know that the swords are associated with the mind and with mental faculties, and the consequence of overthinking, of allowing ourselves to be too driven by that, is or can be serious. So there are responsibilities there. There's also the concept of individuality, the I we saw in the magician, and also the concept of diversity and unity, the idea of the Wheel of Fortune being about more than simply the I, but actually being about others, and we see others in these cards. There's the sun, which is at another level again, the idea of light, oneness. The sun is one of the most positive and bright cards in the deck. The idea that if we go through this cycle of individuality and this cycle of responsibility, that ultimately we're going to return to this cycle of unity, perhaps. We see contrast between the idea of unity and singularity and diversity. We see the contrast between acceptance and action, and we see the birth of consciousness in various different ways. So those are things that I would highlight to you. The other thing that's worth noticing about the tens, by the way, and again thinking about this moving on to ones at a different level, is, and it's associated with the idea of responsibility. Rachel Pollack, in one of her books, I think it might be Tarot Wisdom, talks about or notices that in the Rider deck, certainly, there's an indication there of excess. So you start with one and the power of one, and then you find yourself with excess. And again, sometimes excess can be positive, but it can also be challenging. So a lot will depend, in terms of the constellation of the magician, a lot will depend for you on whether you are looking at these cards, for example the Sun card and the Wheel of Fortune card, as your shadow card or as your personality card, or your soul card or your soul card. And a lot will depend on your calculation. And if you're not sure about how to do that, go back to, I think it's video 2 in this series, and I talk through how to do the calculation to find your birth cards. In terms of readings, I think, there's a lot here in terms of the meanings of these cards and how they relate to each other that can help you in readings. But your homework from this session is exactly that. So I've talked a bit about the principle of one, I've talked about some of the themes of the monad, I've talked about the connection between the magician and the aces, and the connection between the fool and the magician, and the connection between the magician and the Wheel of Fortune and the sun, and of course the tens that flow from the Wheel of Fortune. So I want to hear from you in the comments below how these cards play out for you in readings. So when you see the magician, what does it mean? When you see the aces, what do they mean? What does the Wheel of Fortune mean? What do the tens mean? What do the sun mean? Or the sun mean? And I know that they will mean different things in different cases, but I think we each carry with us an immediate response to those cards, don't we? There are certain things that we think when we see certain cards. So I want to know what you think when you see the cards that are part of the constellation of the magician. That is your homework. And until then, I will see you again very soon. Take care everyone. Bye.